Thousands of people gathered in London this weekend to protest last week's Supreme Court ruling that only biological women are legally recognised as women in the Equality Act. Organisers suggested 20,000 people turned out to the protest in Parliament Square, and they held banners saying trans women are women, protect the dolls, trans rights are human rights, don't steal our rights. Lots of people putting forward that message in a very strong fashion. And one of the protesters in attendance told Reuters this.
Trans people simply just want to go about their lives and live and exist, and that is their right. There's such a tiny proportion of the population today that it's extraordinary that we've let this culture war develop to the point where that we vilify, that they're allowed to be vilified. But it's so clearly to me, it's just like that they are scapegoats, they are patsies for a wider picture for something else that is happening.
Meanwhile, there has continued to be confusion over the implications of the ruling by the Supreme Court last Wednesday. On Thursday, the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Baroness Faulkner, suggested to the BBC that trans women should now be banned from all women-only spaces in all institutions across the country. And that was discussed on Thursday's show. Since then, there has been public disagreement over that interpretation. So a senior civil servant who oversaw the drafting of the Equalities Act has said the legislation was meant to give transgender people with gender recognition certificates the same legal status as biological men or women. And a former Supreme Court judge, Lord Sumption, said this to the BBC. That's the main point, which I think has been misunderstood about this judgment. I think it's quite important to note that you are allowed to exclude trans women from these facilities, but you are not obliged to do it. So, for example, the authorities of a sport such as women's boxing, women's football, are allowed to limit it to biological women. They were not in breach of the discrimination rules of the Equality Act. But the judgment does not mean that the sporting authorities have got to limit women's boxing or women's football to biological women. Now, the ECHR, as it stands, disagrees with Lord Sumption, so there is going to be some sort of playing out of this, I suppose, in the courts or in politics as well. Well, earlier today, and to get the latest on the court ruling and its implications and the movement against it, I spoke to Steph Richards. She is the director of the trans advocacy group Translucent.
I mean, ultimately, the judgment affects trans women with a gender recognition certificate. So that's someone like me. You know, we're talking around 3% of the trans community. We're talking around 3,000 people, many of whom's had gender affirming surgery. So the trans men would have had double mastectomies and grown beards, and trans women would have vaginas and been on HRT for, you know, obviously in some cases decades. And it's for this community that I particularly worry about. We are aware of already suicide attempts, and that's really, really serious. So we are very, very disappointed how the judgment has been portrayed in the media. It's been grossly overplayed. I've given more interviews in the last 3 days than I probably have in the last 3 years. And often they're obviously quite hostile with all the difficult questions that you would expect. But I mean, ultimately, I think what we've got to say to the trans community is, first of all, let's keep calm. Albeit that the media is against us, most of businesses are not. We know that a lot of organisations such as Lloyds Bank, for example, Wix, are incredibly trans supportive. And we still have the right to use single-sex facilities. And obviously the service providers has got the right to stop trans people as long as it's proportionate to a legitimate aim. And so really, for the vast majority of our community, they are not affected, albeit that the hype's obviously been really, really heightened by the media. Trans people like myself, well, I can no longer sit on a public board as a woman. That's the ultimate part of it. And I find that really ironic, because we're not talking about single-sex spaces at all. We are saying that I can no longer sit on a Scottish public board as a woman. because that's what they've achieved.
And I mean, I think sort of politically, in a way, this is one of the biggest turnarounds I can kind of remember in my lifetime. If you sort of think back to the moment in 2017 where sort of Theresa May was pushing for self-ID, where this idea that sort of trans liberation was here. And then we've gone back a number of steps now. And I think sort of the gender critical side are taking this Supreme Court verdict as a complete victory. If
Yes.
Baroness Faulkner, who's head of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, gets her way, I mean, it essentially will be a complete victory for the gender critical side. So I suppose I wanted your thoughts on how this... I know you're sort of saying that the ruling might be more ambiguous than she's making out, or that she's maybe overreached here. But the politics, I think, has undoubtedly shifted. That's why there's no pushback from the Labour Party as to what Baroness Faulkner has said. What's your analysis of how that happened? How in such a short space of time there was just a complete volte-face in the politics of this?
Well, we can actually date to when this actually occurred. It was the 10th of April 2019, with the Liz Truss coming in as Women's and Equalities Minister, literally a few days after a visit from the Vice President of the United States to Boris Johnson, who no doubt told Boris, hey, what are you doing? We are going to have a culture war against the trans community. And let's go for it. This is by creating these campaigns against marginalised small groups, as the trans community are, as refugees are, as indeed Muslims are, we can start to get political ground. It's basically the method of othering, them and us, you know. So we blame refugees, and I say we as a country, the press, because I most certainly don't, because I stand up to racism, as a drain on the economy, on the drain of jobs. And we target trans people on the basis that we're transing kids and that we're groomers and paedophiles and mentally ill, which is exactly the same argument that was used against the gay community in the 70s and 80s. And I think the reason why we're effectively losing, in all honesty, is money. You know, we have organisations out there, I won't name them on this programme, but one far-right evangelical organisation that has offices in London, has accounts going through Companies House, that is over here to take away women's abortion rights, even contraception rights, and trans rights, and LGBT rights. And we can actually track when the whole idea started back to a valued voters summit in America of the far right organisations, together with hate groups, effectively, in splitting the tea from the LGB. And they put lots of money in it. You know, the organisation I'm talking about have declared an income in their last accounts of £1.3 million. That buys an awful lot of coverage in regards to anti-trans rhetoric.
I think it is the case that, the gender critical movement has probably been better funded. I suppose when a political movement loses, and I think there has been a political defeat for the trans movement in this decision and sort of in the reaction to it and the lack of pushback, I think, from mainstream parties. That's partly because Labour are looking at public opinion and they're saying public opinion is against trans inclusion. And I suppose looking back at the past few years, do you think that as well as being up against a strong enemy, there were some mistakes made on the side of people arguing for trans inclusion? I think potentially the combination really of self-ID, trans women are women, and there is no debate. I think those sort of free positions, which were quite widely held, sort of trans women are women, and there's no controversy, no conflict of rights, whatever sphere of life you look in, sports, prisons, whatever, to become a woman, all you have to do is say you're a woman. And by the way, if you try and debate any of these points, that's bigotry. I think that did leave potentially the trans movement in a weaker position than it otherwise could have been. And I'm not sure if there are lessons to learn from that. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I totally agree. When you come out with something like trans women are women, you've got to be able to explain that And what it actually means is that your biological sex, mine is obviously female, don't match my genitals, or didn't match my genitals. I've had surgery now. You're always going to get a pushback on, you can't tell people how to think. You've got to sell it. And unfortunately, when you come out with trans women and women, and I actually identify as trans, incidentally, and I identify as trans purely on the basis that for kids, I think they've got to realise that it's okay to be trans. So I'm very happy, along with many of the trans community, to say, yeah, we're trans. But with trans women or women, that the fact that it was controversial is very difficult. You can understand that women would turn around and say, well, you're erasing us. And I get that. And the no debate, again, was really, really badly put across, because what it was basically saying was, you do not debate people's identity. Everyone's got a gender identity. They might not want to admit it, but they do. And when the government or whoever turns around and say, oh, there's 5 genders, or there's 72 genders, or there's 1 billion genders, well, in actual fact, every gender, every person is their rightful belief to their inner self, to their rightful sex, potentially. So that's really what the no debate was about. But it was put over really badly. It came across as arrogant, as saying, oh no, we're not going to talk to anybody. We're not going to talk to government. We're not going to talk to gender critical people. I mean, I've got gender critical friends. We don't agree on much, but we do agree on lots of other things. You might not agree on sort of biology, or whether people can change sex, or whatever. But ultimately, you do have to talk to these people. And I think it was Moshe Dayan who turned around in the Egypt Israel war, the 7 days war, was it 5 days war? Can't remember. And said, you only make peace by talking to your enemies. And I talk occasionally to gender critical people. The foot shoulders I find okay as a general, whereas the top end's very, very difficult, because they are intransigent in their views. They smell victory. They know they've got the resources to be able to deliver. They know they've got the media on their side. They've got obviously a gender critical Equality and Human Rights Commission, because the EHRC was absolutely stacked by Liz Truss, and then later Kemi Badenoch, by people of their view. So the Daily Telegraph has turned around and named Kishore Faulkner as gender critical. And then we can look back at the tweet of Kemi Badenoch, I think it was in June of last year, where she openly admitted that they had placed gender critical people in positions. And I think she turned around and said the Cass review would never have happened had not gender critical people been put in the NHS. So we have this absolutely massive battle by the fact that many government agencies and within the government itself and other influential organisations have been stacked with gender critical people. That makes it very, very difficult. We're fighting from the outside to start off with. So there are trans allies within Labour Party. The Lib Dems have been really, really good. The Green Party, amazing. But we also have a division within the Labour Party now, which are gender critical. And they've got a lot of strength. And we have to realise that. So I think we've got to, when were we at the bottom? I don't know.